Hi, my name is David Gomez, and this is Mental Health Supra Omnia, Mental Health Above All. We identify and understand mental health issues and the paths for help. Today, we are going to talk about estrangement, particularly parent-child estrangement. Many of us know someone, a family member, a coworker, or a friend who is estranged from their parent or their child. This is one of the largest ongoing issues in mental health today, and an important issue that many do not even know how to begin to solve. With us today, we have two guests. First, the nationally renowned psychologist, Dr. Joshua Coleman. Dr. Coleman is the author of a number of articles and books on estrangement, including The Rules of Estrangement, published in 2021, and is a frequent guest on interviews and podcasts discussing the topic. And even if you haven't heard Dr. Coleman speak before, you may have heard his work, as he's a multi-talented individual whose music has been featured on TV shows including Keeping Up with the Kardashians, Shameless, and Chicago Fire. Also with us today is Dr. Erica Burgoon, Clinical Director of Equilibria Psychological Consultation Services in New Jersey, and Equilibria's Director of Centers of Excellence. Thank you both for joining. I'd like to start with a simple question to you, Dr. Coleman. Most of us probably have some idea of what estrangement means, but what it means to me might be different than what it means to you or to Erica. And so when you discuss estrangement in your work, what are you referring to?
Yeah, I'm typically thinking of a actual cutoff. I know some of my colleagues think of it as sort of a continuum, and I think it's reasonable to think about it as a continuum. But for me, when I think of somebody being estranged, is that there's either no contact or it's so limited that the person who's on the receiving end of the estrangement feels very much cut off. So that might be a parent, say, who maybe they get a Mother's Day card or a birthday card once a year, but otherwise there's absolutely no contact, no return phone calls, no return texts, maybe cut off from social media, etc. So that's typically how I'm thinking about it.
Yeah, so we sometimes hear this term low contact, but we're talking here no or close to no contact. And it's noteworthy to me that maybe this seems a little more evident in this day and age. I think I'll assume 50, 60 years ago, if your child moved a few states away from you and you did only hear from them Mother's Days and birthdays, maybe that wouldn't stand out, but it's you can so pointedly not respond to texts now, block people on social media. So
yeah, I do think the way that we're so available to each other it's both a blessing and a curse, right? It's a blessing that if you're close to a family member, you can get pictures, you can, et cetera. I mean, I often talk about the fact that when I moved from Dayton, Ohio, where I grew up, out to San Francisco, and when I was 21, I mean, there was no way to send my parents pictures or whatever. So it took 2 weeks to come out here. I mean, maybe I called them collect when I got out here 2 weeks later. But now, if a parent writes their kid from Bulgaria and their kid's in San Francisco and they don't respond right away, they feel hurt. And so it's really sort of foreclosed the gap between parents and adult children in ways that if the adult child's wanting to separate more, they don't really have that option in quite the same way. A, and B, there's more opportunities for the parent to feel rejected or neglected or unimportant and that kind of thing. So I do think that is an issue. But I also think that, I've heard some of my colleagues say, well, it's nothing different now. It's just that, it's more public. I don't think that's accurate. I mean, if we just look at divorce rates, we know that from the research, my own research and those of my colleagues, that once a parent divorces, a much higher risk of estrangement. One, because one parent may alienate the child may independently of the parent's behavior choose one parent over the other. The child may not like who the parent remarries or starts to date. So we know that divorce. So we just look at pre-divorce rates of estrangement versus post-divorce of estrangement. We know that there's a huge difference there. Second is non-marital childbirth. 40% of children today are born outside of marriage, and we know that those, particularly for fathers, are really high rates of later estrangement. Then you have the way that therapy and therapeutic narratives have become much more part of the way that we make sense of our lives today. I mean, younger generations are much more likely to be in therapy. Social media, they're much more likely to be exposed to Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook influencers who are talking about the values of becoming estranged. Rising rates of individualism, which is a preoccupation with our own identity, selfhood, and happiness and mental health. And finally, I forget what the final one is, but there's a big one there too. Oh, I know, political differences. So a survey, right? The survey I did with the Harris poll that we published in Time Magazine showed that a lot of people became estranged just for political differences. All of that's historically new. So I think there has been a big shift, to your point, Erica.
Yeah. So I have your book here, Rules of Estrangement. Great read.
Thank you.
I really appreciate, and you just started to get into it, I really appreciate how you took a chapter to sort of name a number of risk factors and then took individual chapters to really delve into them. And the book does such a great job of bringing the psychological and the sociological to life with the case examples that you include.
Thank you.
And I think, there certainly are risk factors that you address as well that I don't think would surprise anyone. Of course, a history of abuse and neglect.
Right.
But I appreciate that we can talk today about some of these risk factors that you name that may not be as evident. Right. I have to say, as a reader of the book, and I have 3 children who are still minors, I love to think I'm a great parent doing a great job. And I actually had moments of, the book shook me, to be honest with you, because you gave examples of parents who thought they were good parents, who thought they were doing the right things, or at the very least do what I think all of us think we do, which is make the best of kind of the cards we were dealt and the resources available to us.
Right.
Found themselves in this really painful position of having their adult child estranged and wondering, why? Where did it go wrong?
Right. Yeah, I have a Substack called Family Troubles, and I wrote a Substack not that long ago that said, dear millennial parents, your kids may estrange you one day too, because I'll often see letters from a millennial parent go, well, I just can't believe the way you treated me now that I have children. I would never treat my child that way. And, and they're probably not treating their child that way. And they're probably being in many ways much better than their parents were to them. That doesn't insulate somebody from a later estrangement. If their kid has mental illness, or the kid gets involved with a therapist who thinks that all problems in adulthood stem from bad parenting and encourages that person to estrange, or the parents divorce and one parent maligns the parent over the other parent, or the adult child just doesn't know any other way to feel separate. So there's this kind of myth. I mean, I don't know if you follow, I was on Oprah a few months ago, and then I saw something with Gayle King where it was her best friend. And Gayle King was saying, well, my kids never did that to me. I would just show up on their doorstep and, tell them that they can't do that. And I'm like, yeah, if you were estranged, if you did that, your kid would file a restraining order on you, because that's typically what happens. So there's this kind of myth in the popular culture that this doesn't happen to good parents, but that is indeed a myth. But it partly persists because if you look at, every day there's some new memoir or first-person essay about why I had to cut out my abusive parent. And so most of the things that we read are from truly abusive parents, where any of us as therapists would think, yeah, I get that. I could see how. And I could imagine supporting that as an estrangement. But I don't even think that's the majority of people who are becoming estranged today.
Yeah. And when you mentioned the example with Gayle King, I think that really highlights, too, in your book highlights how rapidly the power dynamic in the relationship shifts once the child becomes an adult child, and maybe more so as when there's a partner connected to that child. And as I said, as a parent of a couple teens and one who is younger, it really was like, highlighted for me in just a few years. That dynamic changes very rapidly and really markedly.
Yeah, I mean, nothing compels an adult child today to have a relationship with the parent beyond an adult child's desire. And that's a fundamental sea change in how we've organized family life. In the past half century, the rules of engagement that organized families for millennia, honor thy mother and thy father, respect thy elders, families forever, which is still true in many cultures worldwide, has given way to this much more of an emphasis on my own personal identity, my personal happiness, my personal growth. And so now today, if a relationship with a parent isn't in line with that adult child's ideals around their own happiness and mental health and self-awareness and et cetera, not only can that adult child cut off the parent without the same kind of social blowback that there would have been in other generations, but there's a lot of support for doing it. And so if they didn't do it, in some ways they get more criticism that they're somehow, like staying in a bad marriage or something, you're somehow, it's an act of existential cowardice to not cut off difficult family members. So I think it's a serious problem. But to go back to the point that you were making about when our children marry somebody, I mean, that's a huge risk of a later estrangement, because if your kid is vulnerable to it, and they marry somebody who's really troubled, who says, choose them or me, and they're not strong enough to say, no, I'm not going to be in that position where I'm going to be made to choose between my parents and my family. A lot of estrangements happen because of that, which is tragic as well.
Yeah. You mentioned divorce earlier, and of course I want to be clear, like we're not here to malign divorce, but you do note a number of, I appreciated that it wasn't just one factor. You really did a great job of explaining a number of factors that could create an increased risk with divorce. Certainly you mentioned loyalty, perhaps to the parent who primarily raises the child. One of them really stood out to me. I don't think it's named consciously for a lot of people, but how a divorce can sort of really change our conception of family from this insular unit, its own universe, right? To, I was thinking of it almost like, right, like a diffuse, like a tree with diffuse branches. And I get to choose how closely I'm going to align with not only both of my parents that are now divorced, but all the new folks who may come into the picture.
Right.
Step siblings, half siblings, new grandparents.
Yep.
And that really popped to me that I don't know that I've ever heard anyone like name that phenomenon, but reading it, I was like, well, absolutely, that makes sense.
Yeah, Brett, I think when our children are, if you're not divorced, then our children think of us as kind of parents as a family unit. But once we divorce, they don't, then we become more individuals with our own sort of assets and liabilities. And that can be a problem. And also when we divorce, sort of the whatever character flaws may become writ much larger, right? I mean, if one parent sort of compensates for the other's communication disabilities or whatever, that may not be as big of a deal if that other parent's there to kind of constantly correct it. But if that parent's now removed from the mix, and that's a problem, which is probably partly why dads are much more at risk of estrangement post-divorce. There's a recent study that said that something like fathers are 4 times more likely to be estranged than a mother is after, I don't know if it was after divorce, it was just in general, and they're 22% more likely to be estranged from a daughter. And I think in part because fathers often rely on their wives in heterosexual marriages anyway to do the emotional kind of labor and communication and caretaking and the like. And when that's removed, if the dad doesn't really have that skills or hasn't developed that capacity with the children, that can be a real liability in terms of navigating a divorce and staying in close contact.
Yeah. And you also explained it in the other direction, which was painful for me to read. The custodial parent, not always, but usually mom, who may have to work more than one job now, may not be able to be as emotionally available, may be experiencing her own depression as a result of the divorce, and even is doing the best she can, but the way the child experiences that later leads to an estrangement.
Right. I think that's sort of the extra tragedy of this all, is that the child is sort of thinking about it from what they need and how they experience the parent, but they're not really able to factor in what the parent was actually going through and what might have limited their abilities to be as giving or available or that kind of thing at the time. And the additional problem is, when the parent tries to explain that or defend themselves, that just makes them look more defensive and unwilling to self-reflect, which is not going to lead to a reconciliation. So it could become a problem all the way around that way. And dads are also vulnerable to an estrangement in gray divorces, when the children are adults, because then kids are much more likely to ally with mom over dad, and dads are much more likely to prioritize their new partners. And if they have children with that new partner, or even stepchildren with that new partner, they're much more likely to prioritize them or to just be influenced by that partner away from their own children, which is a huge problem.
Sure. With some trepidation, I'm going to highlight another risk factor you named. Of course, I'm a psychologist by trade, so I am a therapist. But note that not all, I want to highlight that, but some therapists in their work create a risk for estrangement. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a serious problem, quite frankly. The sociologist Alison Pugh talks about the fact that in the past 4 decades, our notions of responsibility for others has largely gone under this tremendous transformation more towards the negative, where we don't feel the same obligation to feel caring and responsible for other people, not only in our family, but also, our neighbors or the larger society. And the political scientist Joshua Coleman talks about that in his book, The Age of Responsibility, that welfare, for example, now is something that people have to kind of earn and prove, whereas, the idea of the noblesse oblige, that people who have more resources are more obligated morally to help others. And similarly in family life, that there's kind of a sense, even in an earlier era, not that long ago, the idea of obligation and duty and responsibility. And if that has all given way to this much more identitarian, mental health producing perspective in regards to parent-adult-child relationships. So what Pugh says about that in her book, she's a sociologist, Tumbleweed Society, and she says we're a tumbleweed society because kind of the roots of that sort of kept us grounded and kept us together have all been eradicated or eroded, is that therapists have become what she calls detachment brokers. Meaning we kind of help people not to feel so guilty about not wanting to be responsible or caretaking for other people. So we end up saying things like, well, that's you're being codependent, or that's because you were parentified, or your parents are narcissist or borderline or gaslighter or boundary crosser or whatever it is. And we have enormous power as therapists. I mean, we basically replaced, the clergy in terms of being the moral arbiters of family relationships. So who to keep close to and who to get rid of. We have enormous power in that regard. Any therapist who thinks they don't is being both unethical and naive to not realize that our opinions really, really matter. So if we say, oh yeah, your mom's a narcissist, we might toss it out there. I mean, I can't say I've never said that, but it is fraught because it does greenlight that person towards an estrangement, because you've just depersonalized that parent. If you call somebody's parent a narcissist, you're basically saying, well, they're hopeless, you should protect yourself, etc. I mean, if you're right, even if you're right, if we don't sort of give that person some way to navigate that relationship other than estrangement, and again, there are places where estrangement makes sense, but I don't think nearly as frequently as adult children are being led to believe. So, yeah, I think therapists are an enormous problem in this regard.
Interesting. So in your book, you talk a lot about your work with families where there's been an estrangement. It sounds like often it is the parents that are reaching out to you. Yep. And I think many people might be surprised by some of the things that you do recommend to parents. And yet in the book, you do a great job of explaining the rationale behind them. And I wanted to see if you could offer us a little insight today into what you often do recommend for parents who find themselves facing an estrangement with their child.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing is to find the kernel, if not the bushel of truth in the child's complaints, to lead with empathy and care and curiosity. And to, I always encourage parents to start the letter by saying, I know you wouldn't do this unless you felt like it was the healthiest thing for you to do. Now, the parent may not feel like it's the healthiest. I may not as a therapist, but it doesn't really matter. The adult child is doing it because they feel like it's the healthiest thing for them to do in terms of their mental health and happiness. Then the parent's not going to be able to get on the same page with them unless they can just acknowledge that basic fact. Then they do have to speak to the things that may or have clearly caused the adult child to estrange themselves. And I think, in AA, they have the fourth step of make a fearless and searching moral inventory of your character flaws. I think the same is true for parents, particularly if a kid has cut them off, to really be as honest and courageous as you can in acknowledging the things that you did or said that were hurtful or destructive or damaging to the child. Both in the spirit of repair, but also to position yourself as somebody who's open to working on the relationship and getting critical feedback and repairing it. And I think those parents who can do it can find that they have a much better relationship with the child. And it's the only pathway towards a potential reconciliation. But I think even for parents who aren't yet estranged, being able to learn how to speak in that language, be empathic, don't explain, don't defend, don't blame the child, don't blame their therapist, don't blame your ex. All those things are much much more likely to lead to a potential close relationship than doing all those other things, which are kind of, the human nature to do. I'll sometimes see on the forums from the parents forum, like, oh, Coleman just wants us to grovel, he just thinks it's all, he never takes the parent's side. Is really, I certainly think I take the parent's side, but to me, it's about humility, not humiliation. Every parent makes mistakes with their child. So if your perspective is that you didn't make mistakes with your child, you're just wrong. That doesn't mean you deserve to be estranged. And that's what I think is confusing for parents and why it's hard to write these letters. But having a lot of humility about it, and if you don't really understand, to say, well, I don't understand, but I would like to. If you can let me know, I'm open to doing family therapy. I'm open to working on these issues in my own therapy. If you give me more feedback. So, that is the 21st century model of parent-adult-child relationships. It's much more psychological. It's much more egalitarian. It's much more sensitive. It has to be open to reviewing the childhood, looking at how you may have impacted your child. And, it's not surprising that so many parents struggle with this because they're really the first generation that's had to do it like this, right? I'm a boomer. I wasn't like facing my parents with how they screwed up as parents when they raised me. I don't think any of us would have necessarily even considered doing that. But today, that's kind of more the norm than the exception.
Yeah, I hear it. We sometimes, find ourselves asking people, is it more important to be right or more important to be happy?
Exactly.
Yeah, and I hear that struggle of parents like, this isn't right. I want to defend what I think is right. And yet, if they're coming to you with the ultimate goal of reunifying, it sounds like, being able to approach that with humility, even if it's hard, that is a pathway forward.
Yeah, it's very hard for any parent to face the ways that we failed our children or hurt them, and particularly the language of younger generations, which, where trauma can be part of the equation, or harm or abuse or neglect in ways that to the parent can just feel completely indecipherable from how they feel like they raised their child. But learning how to kind of, accept that this is how your child views you. First of all, it's not an easy thing to do because I think the vast majority of parents really raise their children with a great degree of dedication and hope and love. So when they hear that they've kind of failed their child in the most important task in their whole life, it is hard for any parent to not be defensive. But the more quickly you can recover from that and try to communicate in the ways that I'm recommending, the better it's likely going to go.
You mentioned a few don'ts, I think, in there, not defending. Are there do you have, a few top tips for parents in terms of if they find themselves in this position of estrangement, things not to do?
Yeah, what I often tell parents is there's only two things you can do right if you're completely no contact with your kid. One is to write a really good amends letter, and I talk about it some in my book. I also have a new workbook out for estranged parents called Breakout, which they can email me to it's not on Amazon or anything because I don't want to give Amazon half of my money. But they can email me through my website. So you can write a really good amends letter, and then if you don't get a response, do a follow-up 6 to 8 weeks later to check in. And that's about all you can do if your child is not in contact with you. And I don't encourage parents to keep apologizing or keep reaching out. For some adult children, they really do need and want the space. And so continuing to reach out can really work against them. So there's only a couple things you can do right if your kid's not in contact with you at all. There's a bunch of things you can do wrong, right? You can show up at their house or their place of employment. Don't ever do it. It always backfires. You can, and as I was saying earlier, you can blame them. Well, you had a lot of issues. You had addictive issues. You had to go to a therapeutic boarding school. Or you could blame your ex if you're divorced. Well, your dad poisoned you against me, or your mom poisoned you against me. You can blame the therapist. Well, you have a therapist that's brainwashed you. You can blame their person that they're married to or they're dating. You can try to explain it away. You can try to defend yourself. All those things. None of those things work, and they only work against your relationship because as soon as you make your child feel like you're not really taking responsibility, then game over. You just lost them as an audience. You have to show that you're able to engage in self-reflection. And if you really don't know and you really don't understand, it's okay to say that, but you then still have to say, well, it's clear that I have significant blind spots, that I don't have a better understanding of why you need to do this, but I would like to learn. And if you want to write me or call me, I promise to listen, to read purely to understand and not to defend myself. So these are big asks of parents, but there just really isn't another way. Sometimes parents will say, well, can't I just like do it, some subset of that? I was like, no, it's black and it's white. You can either be empathic, take responsibility, and do these things, or not. But there's not a third way as far as anything. I mean, if somebody learns of one, I'm all ears, but I haven't seen one.
All right. I'm wondering, like I said, you gave a lot of stories in the book that really, brings the material to light. Is there a top story that stands out to you, a parent who came to you that you thought that there's just no way, something that maybe can give us hope for the work that can be done here when parents find themselves in this position where there was a reconciliation?
Yeah, I'm not always surprised, but I'm sometimes surprised in both directions. Sometimes, like if I'm doing reconciliation therapy where the adult child's willing to meet with the parents to consider reconciling with them, I've been surprised sometimes that the parent seemed more psychological, and then once the child got in the room, just couldn't take the counsel, just couldn't help themselves from defending or getting mad or defensive or blaming the child or their ex or whatever. And what I tell parents by way of coaching before they get into the session is I say, this isn't marriage therapy, where you get to have an equal claim about how this relationship has affected you, or what your terms are for going forward, or how often you get to see your child or grandchildren. It's more like you're divorced and your ex is willing to give the relationship, potential another chance, but it's going to be on their terms. Similarly, if a child is estranged, they've already proven that they can live without you. They may, have guilt, anxiety, shame about it, but they've already demonstrated that they can. So it's going to need to be on their terms. And some parents can walk that walk and other parents can't. And sometimes it's a parent who I think, oh, they're probably not yet ready to do this, but they say they're ready, and then they really get it and can really make the kind of amends and show the kind of honesty and non-defensiveness, and that can be often very persuasive to the child who's feeling more skeptical. Because sometimes an adult child will say to me, they're not yet willing to do therapy. Well, I don't think my parents are capable of changing in that way. And I always say, well, you might be right. But I never know until I get in the room with them, A, and B, nothing's going to make a parent want to dig deeper and do better than knowing that they have already lost their child and could potentially get that child back. Nothing's going to cause them to be on better behavior and really figure out why they behaved in the ways that they have that were so hurtful or problematic, other than being faced with the loss of their adult child. So this is because sometimes the adult child will say to me, well, they need to go do their own work. And I'm like, they're not going to do their own work in the way that you want them to do it. I guess if somebody had, would go, that meant going into recovery or we're going through an anger management program, sure. But if it's like being sensitive to the child in the ways that they do, I think family therapy is a far better mechanism for that, because that way the therapist can really see the dynamic, see what provokes the parent, see how the parent can respond productively versus unproductively. So I just think family therapy is a much better mechanism. And not to self-promote too much, but I am coming out with a new book in the fall called Estrangement, Reconciliation Therapy. So hopefully that'll be in the stores or available in the fall. So, and it's written for therapists who want to do this kind of work. So yeah.
Wow. I really appreciate the wealth of information and experience sharing here today. Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it was a pleasure to talk to you.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you as well for coming on. And we are just about at time, and I just wanted to ask if there is anything else that you feel would be important for parents who may be estranged, children who may be estranged that we didn't cover today. Any last advice or anything like that you could share with us, or if not, then that's fine too.
Sure. I mean, the only other point that I would make is, I'm often asked in interviews, like with journalists, well, at what point should a parent, should an adult child cut off a parent? And what I say is, I'm happy to answer that question from my perspective, but as a society, we have to reckon with the fact that estrangements are not typically just a dyadic or a triadic event between the parent, or the parents and the adult child. It fractures the whole family system. Typically, parents get cut off from grandchildren get cut off from grandparents more typically. Cousins, if there's young cousins and the siblings are estranged, they get cut off. Aunts and uncles may come in to kind of fill the gap in ways that can be really problematic in the family system. So it really fractures the whole family. And I think we as therapists and as a society have to reckon with the fact that when we support estrangements, we have to think several generations down the line. So that's probably just my main parting thought about it. Well, the other parting thought is if you're an estranged adult child, I think there is a place to go no contact or low contact. But my wish is that people would give their parent really clear guidance about what a healthy reconciliation would look like, and then revisit it, in a year or so, because a lot of parents may look hopeless at year one or at the inflection point of estrangement. But sometimes the estrangement can be kind of a shot across the bow that may cause the parent to feel like, oh shit, I better really, rethink my relationship with this child and really figure out how to do this differently. And they may be in a much better, more pliant place if you do come back. So my kind of wish is that people wouldn't do it forever, in part because I work every day with these heartbroken parents and grandparents who really would do anything to make the relationship better. So I guess that's my parting thought.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Coleman, Dr. Burgoon. Sponsor for this podcast today is Equilibria Psychological and Consultation Services, a Philadelphia area insurance-based provider whose mission is to help individuals achieve their personal potential and long-term growth. You can look for Equilibria by searching Equilibria PCS on Google or by finding them on Facebook, Instagram, or LinkedIn. To be clear, I am not a medical professional, and the opinion of the speakers today is their own opinions. This podcast is copyrighted and cannot be reproduced without the express written consent of EPCS Management, LLC.